Mike McDermott, and today's video is going to focus on two campaigns that occurred relatively early during the Revolutionary War. Once the Continental Army was chased out of New York, they moved across New Jersey with the British in pursuit. And once General Washington was able to get his troops across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, the British called a halt to their pursuit and decided to go into winter quarters. They pushed one of their German mercenary units forward to occupy the town of Trenton, New Jersey. And that's where the story picks up. Following Trenton, General Washington moved to Princeton, a nearby town, and conducted an attack there. Again, surprising the British and humbling the British garrison that was in Princeton. Following that, he led the Continental Army into winter quarters. But at any rate, we'll start today's video with the Trenton campaign. After evacuating Long Island and then Manhattan Island, narrowly escaping disaster in both cases, General Washington's troops retreated across New Jersey, closely pursued by the British. The Continental Army was wasting away because of expiring enlistments and because of desertion. But early in December 1776, Washington got his diminished force across the Delaware River successfully and went into camp. The British stopped their pursuit and went into winter quarters in a series of outposts across New Jersey, while the Continentals began to catch their breath and received much needed reinforcements. General Washington knew he had to restore confidence in his army, to encourage enlistments, and decided to recross the Delaware River at McConkey's Ferry with a force of 2,400 men and 18 guns. He intended to attack the 1,500 German mercenaries that had been garrisoned in Trenton. An additional 700 American militia were to make a crossing at the Trenton Ferry and seize a bridge over Assunpink Creek, an action intended to seal the Germans' escape once General Washington succeeded in his attack. An additional militia corps was to cross at Bristol with 1,800 men and to launch a diversionary attack. George Washington and the main force, each man carrying 60 rounds of ammunition and 3 days' rations, approached the wind-whipped and ice-choked river the night of 25 December 1776 in a driving, freezing blizzard. The troops crossed using Durham freight boats, which were in common use on the river at that time. The boats were roughly 50 feet long and 10 feet wide. And they were decked at both ends and also had cleated walking boards along both sides for men to pole the boats. Large ferries were also used to get the cannon and the horses across the Delaware River. Both militia units decided the conditions were too tough and too difficult, and they didn't even make an effort to get across the river. And at the same time, they were not able to notify General Washington of their decision to not go. General Washington's force was undaunted and across the river by 3 o'clock in the morning. It then took them an hour to get organized before they could get on the road. Some men did not have boots and wrapped their feet in burlap, and in fact there was blood in the snow and on the muddy roads as they began to move toward Trenton. Several civilians joined as impromptu guides, and 2 soldiers could not persevere and died of exposure on the march. Ice and blowing sleet and behind schedule, the Army divided about halfway to the objective. One wing, commanded by General James Sullivan, continued on the road along the river, and the other wing, commanded by General Nathaniel Greene, swung to the left on another track before entering the outskirts of the town. The Americans surprised the German outposts about 8 o'clock on a gray and freezing winter morning and attacked directly into the town. Colonel Henry Knox's artillery played a key role by clearing the streets and breaking up groups of hastily forming German mercenaries. The Germans attempted several counterattacks, but they were soundly defeated. The German commander, Colonel Rahl, was mortally wounded, attempting to rally his troops, and the majority of the Germans were forced to surrender. American losses were 4 dead from wounds and exposure and 8 wounded, while the Germans lost 22 men killed and 918 captured. General Washington's success provided a much-needed boost to rebel morale, and it also shocked the British. And General Cornwallis was immediately ordered to march with an army of 6,000 troops to crush the troublesome Continental Army. But following the battle, General Washington recrossed back into Pennsylvania, again using the boats at McConkey's Ferry. Private John Greenwald later recorded his impressions following the fight at Trenton. The Hessian prisoners, who were all grenadiers, numbered about 900. On the march down to the boats, seeing some of our men were much pleased with the brass caps which they had taken from the dead Hessians. Our prisoners, who were exceedingly frightened, pulled off those that they were wearing and gave them away. With those brass caps on, it was laughable to see how our soldiers would strut and dance, some with no shoes. Colonel Fitzgerald also updated his diary. Here we are back in our camp with the prisoners and trophies. Washington is keeping his promise. He has just given directions for tomorrow's Christmas dinner. All the captured Hessian officers are to dine with him. He bears the Hessians no malice, but says they have been sold by their duke or their king and sent to America. They would be peacefully living in their own country if it had been their choice. It's a glorious victory. Washington has pounced upon the Hessians like an eagle upon a hen. And so ended the much publicized Battle of Trenton, a relatively small affair, but it gave great hope to all of those who were placing much value on General Washington and his Continental Army. Next, on to Princeton. While in camp, just across the river in Pennsylvania, when General Washington learned that a force of 6,000 British troops were preparing to march, he led 5,100 men back across the Delaware River to Trenton on the 29th of December, just 3 days after defeating the German mercenaries there. The Americans established a defensive position on high ground on the outskirts of the town with a difficult obstacle, a Sunpick Creek to their front and the Delaware River directly to their back. Early on 2 January 1777, a strong detachment of American riflemen was sent forward on the Princeton road to delay the British, who were on the move. After leaving a rear guard at Princeton, the enemy's approach was slowed by constant harassing fire until they finally chased those skirmishers through Trenton and into the American lines late in the afternoon. Having assessed the situation, General Cornwallis ordered a frontal assault to overrun the American position. He realized that they were backed up against the river. The British were channeled, however, into choke points, including a stone bridge and several fords across the creek, where they encountered concentrated fire. Particularly effective was General Henry Knox's artillery, which was well placed and deadly. After suffering 3 bloody repulses, General Cornwallis stopped the action and settled in to renew his attack at daylight. Confident of the position and his superior force, he reportedly boasted that he was preparing to bag the fox in the morning. The defensive position that the American Army occupied at Trenton, backed up against the Delaware River, caused concern among many, to include a young ensign from Virginia, a man named Robert Beale. He later wrote, "This was the most awful crisis. No possible chance of crossing the river, ice as large as houses floating down." A Captain Stephen Orley agreed. "It appears to me then that our army was in the most desperate situation I had ever known it. We had no boats to carry us across the Delaware, and the British would surely destroy us against the river." General Washington had been repeatedly disappointed and embarrassed by militia units running from the enemy, and while the ground he selected was certainly advantageous for defense against British attacks coming across the creek, the position also ensured that the more unsteady elements in his force had fewer options for an untimely and hasty departure. One of the reasons he selected that position was to ensure that his militia would stand firm. Colonel Charles Scott, a Virginian, chose to focus on what was in front of him rather than what was behind him. And he gave his regiment the following guidance. "Now I want to tell you one thing," he said. "You're all in the habit of shooting too high. You waste your powder and lead, and I've cursed you about it 100 different times." Sound like a good man. "Take care now and fire low. Bring down your pieces, fire at their legs. One man wounded in the leg is better, for it takes two more to carry him off, and there goes three." General Washington recognized the bulk of the British Army had closed on Trenton, leaving rear areas lightly defended, and he saw an opportunity. His initial objective would be the enemy's rear detachment at Princeton. And as midnight approached, the Americans prepared to withdraw from their positions, leaving a detachment of 500 men and 2 cannon to confuse the enemy. The stay-behind force was ordered to keep the fires burning, and then at first light they were to pull out and rejoin General Washington at Princeton. At 2 o'clock in the morning of 3 January, the troops filed out of their positions to march. Their objective was only 8 miles away. Artillery wheels were wrapped in burlap to deaden the noise, and the men departed silently, very aware of the enemy's near presence. Their route was by side roads, and they had successfully bypassed the British position well before sunrise. 2 regiments of the British rear detachment at Princeton had been ordered forward to Trenton and were on the road to join General Cornwallis when they saw a unit of the Continental Army approaching them. The British immediately formed up and attacked the 350 American soldiers who they had encountered. Initially, British training and discipline paid off, and a bayonet charge scattered the Americans. 2 cannon were captured and turned on the fleeing survivors when 1,100 American militia arrived to stop the enemy advance. Inexperienced and unable to get into a battlefield formation, the militia fired a volley and also began to leave the battlefield. At that point, General Washington joined the action with several regiments of Continental soldiers and was able to stabilize that situation by ordering the militia to fall in with the Continentals. And they did. Riding out in front of the line with his hat in his hand, he waved the troops forward. When the American line was about 30 yards from the enemy, he turned his horse to face the troops, and he ordered halt, and then he ordered fire. The British fired at the same time, and when the smoke cleared, General Washington was still waving his hat, to the immense relief of John Fitzgerald, the Continental officer who later wrote how he covered his eyes for fear that he would see the general killed. The enemy began to withdraw, and the Americans focused on overrunning British defenses on the edge of the town of Princeton. Once in the town, the troops found Nassau Hall occupied by British soldiers. Captain Alexander Hamilton brought up 3 cannon and blasted in the front door after the British defenders refused to surrender. The day's action ended when a white flag appeared and 194 of the enemy emerged from the building. Learning that General Cornwallis and his troops were on the road from Trenton and fast approaching, the Americans withdrew. Casualty reporting was not very precise, and General Washington recorded that 25 to 30 men had been killed at Princeton. A young naval officer from Pennsylvania who had been granted leave to serve as a volunteer in the campaign described his impression of the action to his wife. "It was a glorious day, and I would not have been absent from it for all the money I ever expect to be worth." General Washington's greatness was far beyond my description. I shall never forget what I felt at Princeton on his account when I saw him brave all the dangers of the field and his important life hanging, as it were, by a single hair with 1,000 deaths flying around him, end quote. And thus ended the campaign at Princeton. Again, a short, sharp action. Men were killed and wounded. The Continental Army had accomplished their tactical mission, and when they left, they moved to go into winter quarters. Let me ask you to subscribe and to comment on these 2 campaigns and on the way in which the story of the Army's combat history is beginning to unfold. And until then, God bless our America.